We are live, guys. How you doing? I want to just preface this before we get started that my internet should be good. My internet's solid, but I did just do one of those Bill Gates updates. So usually, sometimes the computer kind of lags behind for at least a couple hours after I do one of those for some reason. So if I do drop out, I will be right back. I will leave Gov hanging for too long. But Governor did join us today, and I wanted to have an NFL discussion because it's been a long time since we got to talk to the NFL ago. But let's just smile about that for a second.
Football.
And not just
Yes.
football, but our brand of football, man. Like, I don't know if you saw, but Bill Belichick was asked about fantasy football, and he was like, I don't care about fantasy football. I'm just out for wins. And I thought it was funny because people wanted to make a big deal, but like, oh, he doesn't care about fantasy football.
He shouldn't. Bill Belichick never has. That's not his goal.
But that's my point, Gov. It's like, well, I don't care about the special team ace that he's going to have to decide between cutting or not cutting. Like, like 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now, when he's in the office and he's trying to decide who's the young kid he's going to make dreams come true, Disney style, or the kid he's going to shatter the dreams of, that's on him. Like, I don't want that responsibility, but this is what me and you do. So, like, I don't know why people can't understand that, like, we can play Patriot players or we can, like, have respect for Bill Belichick and then be okay with him being like, I don't care about fantasy football. Like, I just never understood that. But this is the brand of football we play, and they do bridge together quite nicely. And I actually would say that Bill Belichick would probably be more of a fan of fantasy football than he thinks if he actually had the time to dedicate to it. But that's a topic I'm going to come full circle on, Gov, at the end of this conversation here. But let's first dive into when salaries came out week one for us DFS players. We know how much for a Christmas present that kind of feels. That anticipation is finally there. The bubble has been sitting there. You might be watching your favorite streamer for weeks. They're doing mock drafts. They're doing the puppy drafts, the best ball drafts, and then all of a sudden, salaries drop. When that happened, what was your initial thoughts? And then, like, how excited were you? Like, what did you do first? Kind of walk people through, like, how you attack when you first find out salaries got released.
I was expecting it. Like, I know that around the time of beginning of August, usually a month before, is when they put out their salaries for week one. I don't know why they do that a month before. And like, I'm not sure why, but I knew it was coming. So I was anticipating it. And when they finally did drop, I admit I was not the first to find out. I knew it was coming, but I jumped in the Discord to talk with people, and they were already like, hey, check this lineup out I can build for week one. Like, oh, and then I immediately jumped on Draftkings and started looking at the prices and the lineups. Immediately. As soon as I saw the first, like, hey, this looks good for week one, right? I immediately was looking at the prices. And I've had some thoughts looking through them. I haven't deep dove because I have a month. So I'm going to focus on best ball, learn the teams more, get my info down before I deep dive into a week one build. But I already have a few week one builds and a few like, I've looked at it from a large perspective, like a wide perspective, and I was ecstatic. Like, again, but I was waiting on it. So it was like Christmas morning. The presents are coming, but when do they get there?
Right. Well, that's where I think we're at, Gov. I think we're at like November 16th in terms of the Christmas calendar, right? Like, mom's at Toys R Us, or I use Toys R Us because they're no longer available, so there's no consumer bias here. But she's at Toys R Us and she's putting things on layaway at this point, Like, we don't have to be married to these ideas. Now, some of these prices were exciting, but we're gonna get a training camp injury or like a setback. And
we immediately did. The prices came out, and then like the next week, you lost offensive lineman for the Buccaneers, and Tim Patrick blew his knee in Denver, and so
Yep.
it's already happened.
Julio Jones gets signed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Godwin's practicing, but yeah. A lot of stuff is still to happen. That's why, I'm not going to focus. It's good to take a look at these. It is very good to take a look at them, have an idea of what the salaries look like week one.
Yeah.
But then you need to take a step back, start doing some research on the games, and you have all the time to do it.
And I don't know if I'm breaking news for you, but I heard that Hollywood Brown might be in some legal trouble, which would open up a guy like Wesley, who's like $3K right now on Draftkings, just for an example, still minimum essentially.
To be fair, to be fair, that was one of the stacks I looked at early because I like the Arizona stack because both Hopkins and Brown are probably going to be out either due to injury or whatever first week of the season. Right. So that's the one where you can get a premium quarterback and 2 cheap receivers to go with him.
And I want to preface, when we say cheap receivers, we are talking about Zach Ertz as well as I'm going to bring up Zach Ertz here. We can look at it.
I wasn't, but that's only because he's kind of a mid-price tight end. So he's not really cheap, but he kind of is. I think he's close to the same price as, actually, let me look real quick.
He's
Arizona.
He's 4,400.
Right. So AJ Green and James Conner are more than him, but he's more than the Rondale Moores and the Isabellas, the Wesleys.
I think everyone wants it to be more because he was
the golden boy last year. He's the one that everyone thought was going to break out, and they were using more. But I do remember at end of the year when you knew you couldn't get much out of AJ Green and Hopkins was down, they were giving Wesley run.
Yeah, I like this kid more, man. But I don't know if week one is the way. You can like a toy. I can like a car in a garage, but I don't want to drive it every day. You wouldn't drive a convertible where you would want to drive a Jeep. You got to know your terrain. And speaking of knowing your terrain, what's the biggest mistake you can make in week one DFS?
Oh, let's see. That's rough.
And I don't
if you're just a normal you're not playing DFS every day, you're coming in, it's week one football season, you're just trying to build a lineup. The biggest mistake I would say is because we don't have a lot of data, everyone's 0-0. People are going to be a lot more homerish on their picks. You're going to see a lot more people willing to make a Baltimore stack or a Cleveland stack or a Washington stack week one because they're fans of the Washington football team. They're fans of the Cleveland Browns. They're fans of the Houston Texans. But those are not going to be good stacks. You're not going to be able to build a really good lineup with those guys. I would say, as much as you want to say the layman guys want to get different, especially week one, when we don't have a lot of info, I wouldn't get too different. I would stick to the good plays that we know they're going to be as much as possible.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see the screen, but I pulled up Daniel Jones. I think this is the guy that the casuals are going to go to. And I don't even mean that in a bad way or a discriminating way. It's just the people that are casually going to say oh, it's week one, I'm going to go to my buddy's barbecue. Let me put $5 in the line. They're going to go to guys like Daniel Jones, to Gov's point, and I think Trey Lance is going to be very popular at 5K.
At Chicago, yep. Derek Carr at the Chargers, Carr is probably the best of the bad plays, but there's going to be a lot more people playing Lance, Carr, Tua, Fields, Matt Ryan, stuff like that. When, especially a quarterback like week one, just looking at the pricing, it's not some market thing where there's all these 8+K quarterbacks. It's hard to fit in. No one's that expensive. Like, if you're playing Trey Lance, how are you not finding $100 to just play Kirk Cousins? Like that, That's the kind of stuff, like, don't be too far off. There's some clear misprices, usually at running back and quarterback week 1. And then just try to correlate. Another thing a lot of people don't do, correlate. Correlation, especially in football, is very potent. Making sure you have a receiver that is on the same team as your quarterback. Making sure you have 2 or 3 players from the game that you think is going to be a high-scoring game. Like, those are very important when building your lineup, as opposed to guys who will just, I'm going to take Daniel Jones, but then you're going to take Daniel Jones with no Giants receivers, and then you're going to have Jonathan Taylor and like Chase Edmonds of Miami or something, or Ramondre Stevenson or something like that. You're not going to correlate anything. You're going to have just a bunch of random dudes that you like and try to fit everything in. It's like, I'll go cheap here. It's like, no, you go cheap with that extra wide receiver that you're stacking. You go cheap with your tight end, and you go cheap at defense. But you don't just like, oh, I'm just going to plug in 3 cheap running backs into my running backs and flex and then fit everything else I want. That's not smart. And there's going to be a lot of people doing that. I remember when I first started playing DFS, that was my first couple of lineups was, okay, let me just try to build a lineup with 9 guys that I really like, as opposed to targeting something and trying to build around that. But then again, that's the difference between a normal, everyday, just I'm going to throw $5 in for fun, and guys like us who grind DFS every day.
Well, even the grinders
can get that tunnel vision too, and they'll forget.
Yeah. I mean, I was listening to a podcast with talking about grinders. So this was like a present. We talked about presents, Christmas earlier in the show. This is a present for anyone that's a real grinder will know. John Daigle, of 444, was speaking about how he hates looking at week 1 salaries. And he likes playing DFS, but he thinks even like the most hardcore guys, even maybe he was saying that even maybe the hardcore guys are at the biggest disadvantage week 1, opposed to your casual on the crapper kind of guy building his lineup 5 minutes before church, because it's just longer of a period to set in a bias. Like football already has that baked into itself, where it's like you have so much longer than, say, an NBA slate or a hockey slate, or even I'll give my international viewers some love, EPL slate. Like football is a week-long thing, and now we got 3 weeks, and we're just going to be staring at these lineups. I do believe that some people are going to bake in this bias of, Tavarius Toney is 4K, or 4,100, I believe.
Right.
And Daniel Jones is 5K. So Gov told me on a podcast to stack or to correlate, so I'm going to do that.
To be fair, that's not as bad as just someone grabbing Daniel Jones.
It's not.
As long as the rest of the line, but then again, as a DFS player, I'm going to take that thing and be like, okay, what's the rest of the lineup look like? Because having a Daniel Jones Toney stack means a specific thing to a lineup. I'm like, it's not a high-end play. It's not going to be one of them. I really doubt it will be one of the more owned plays. So it's a leverage play. And if that's where you're getting your leverage, just make sure the rest of your lineup isn't a crap ton of leverage plays.
Right.
You don't need to leverage everything. You can eat some of the good plays that everyone's playing, but you shouldn't play all of those guys. That's the thing. The key to DFS is having a balance between the plays that everyone likes and is playing and the leverage plays that no one's on, and having a right mix of those in your lineup to build a solid lineup for the contest you're playing. Because you build a different lineup for a cash game and a tournament. You build a different lineup for a 1,000 man tournament as you do for a 10,000 man tournament.
Right. See, I almost equate it to this, Gov. It's like you can. Okay, so one time my friend came to me. He said, "Oh man, we want to do a nice wedding, but we have a budget, but we don't want to go like super cheap with everything, but we can't go super expensive with all things, right?"
Right.
And my biggest thing was just okay. So he's like, "How would you save?" Let's just, I don't even remember the number. Let's just say he said, let's say, how do you save $1,000? And my answer to that was cut the kids' meals down. So if you want to serve a nice steak dinner at a wedding, you serve it to all the adults, but make a special menu for the kids under a certain age. You know, and I think that's kind of like building a DFS lineup. It's like, it's not that you can't have the steak. It's not that we can't have a Lamar Jackson or a Kyler Murray, but you got to mix and match to get it to, it's the whole consumption of your plate, Gov. It's not just, oh, you got Kyler Murray, now you're set. It's how was that, steak cooked? What went with it? Did you serve it with good potato? Stuff of that nature. Did they correlate? Does it go together? Like, you could say ice cream is delicious, but you probably wouldn't want it all over your steak. There are things that just don't make sense, right?
Right.
And we see this in other sports, especially like you'll see baseball lineups, for example, that have too much correlation, where they'll have like the pitcher and then a bunch of hitters, and it's like, what are you doing? Well, I'm a Yankees fan, so I loaded up. It's like, yeah, so even correlation can go wrong in a way.
It can. So, again, you have to be smart with your lineups. It's not just blind, like you're saying. You're not just blindly being like, oh, I'm going to stack this. Let me just put in 4 players from that team and then just move on from there. I'm like, no.
Right. So we talked about what casuals will do wrong, and correlation is kind of the next step. But even something that a lot of hardcore people say they do, Gov, that they don't actually do, that because a lot of these content creators are like big professional guys, they're grinding for days and days, and so the weekend finally comes around, and that's kind of where they have to fit in their family time. So late swapping is still a huge edge for the lower tiered players. I would say like the guy coming up, the college kid who wants to like make it big. You got to late swap. You got to stay on the news when everyone else isn't. I know Gov's a big fan of Showdown. These type of instantaneous kind of like, I would say like instantaneous moments or sports where you're like grinding the news wire all the time. That's where the edges come. Even preseason, for example. I mean, it might sound silly, but if you really want to grind some edges, preseason's a good way to do it.
That is true. 100% true.
So speaking on, I kind of set us up there with a softball, but to go a little bit deeper, Joe, I'll give you the floor now. What do you think is the biggest mistake that experienced players make?
Okay. That one I put a little thought into because I feel like I hit that mistake earlier this year playing NBA. And I think too often the experienced players, now this might not be the really top end guys, the Awesimos, like Leone, stuff like that, because I feel like they've hit this before more than once, and so they are aware of it and keep track of it. But the swings that you have in DFS tend to affect you a little more than you think when it comes to the confidence you have in your lineups, and then when it also comes to your bankroll management. I've seen it too often. You get on a hot streak, you build your bankroll, and then just before or just as the down streak's about to hit, because you're going to hit it, you make a bad decision with your bankroll, and now all of a sudden you get to what should have just been a small down streak or a normal down streak, and you doubled the pain. That now you have to work your way back up. I've seen too many guys try to take a step forward, and then when they take that step back to sort of settle, they fall back. If that makes any sense.
Okay,
but it's all their decision. So I would say the biggest thing they have a problem with is their overconfidence, which leads into poor bankroll management.
Let me jump in there for a minute, Go. So you made a really good point, but I want to elaborate on a way that I won't say in layman's terms, but I want to kind of give it its own platform, and so people can visualize what you're saying. And so let's assume that's you. Let's assume that your test model A and what you just described, you're not giving yourself time. You're feeling rough.
You don't even have to assume. Like I said, I ran through this about March, April April, May of the NBA season, just before the playoffs.
Okay, so
start of the playoffs. I had this exact scenario where I started being good. I was doing on a good grind. Then I banked a tournament and hit a few good times. And from that point, I started thinking, okay, this is how it should go. Let me keep doing this. And then I also, at the same time, upped my bankroll when I shouldn't have. I started playing more. And when the down streak hit, I lost a lot of my bank money in a short amount of time when that should have lasted me. That money should have lasted me through baseball season, and I had to grind that back up at the end of NBA.
So I want to talk about content. I want to talk about contest selection in a few minutes, but to put a bow on the lineup construction element of how. So let's say that happened to you right before week one, and now you're like, things were good. Then I upped my bankroll, and then I started playing contests I shouldn't have. And like, let's assume, so the good and the bad of that. So now you're about to go into week one. What are some things you should do if that's already happened to you?
If you've already been through the overconfidence and bankroll mismanagement.
Right.
If that's already happened to you and you've ground your way and now you're trying to prepare for the NFL season.
Right. So that happened to you in the NBA. That was a real example.
That happened to me in April and May.
And so now week one, you finally built it up a little bit. You're like, okay, I learned my
I built it back up. I have a solid bankroll to start football.
If you were to start a lineup, how would you go about it? Do you think that humbles you? Do you think that's in the back of your mind?
It is definitely something I have thought about all year. I have put little Post-it notes around my computer in that to remind me to don't do that stuff. To remind me, you don't need to enter that extra contest. I think a lot of new I don't even know what the word is. Not pro, but like a lot of the newer everyday DFS players make a mistake of, and it's something it's told to them by the people out there. So I'd like to kind of adjust this for people listening. If you've ever heard the term overlay and you're one of the people who knows how to go and chase overlay in a contest, because basically what that means is contests have guaranteed prize pools. They want it to fill to a certain amount to cover the money they've guaranteed. There are times when contests don't fill to that amount, so they still run, but they didn't get all the money pulled in that Draftkings would want to cover the contest. That's sort of free money in the contest. It's like, well, Draftkings is throwing money out there that they never got back. And there's people who should have been at the back end of the contest paying the rake and paying for everyone else's winnings that just aren't in there. So there's less people to play against, but you're still getting all the same payouts and benefits. Yeah. So people will chase overlay. I would not do that as a newer small bankroll person. You don't need to do that. You don't need to be sitting in the lobby. Once you've got your lineup, sitting in the lobby 10 minutes before lock, just looking at contests and be like, oh, this one's not going to fill. Let me throw $5 into that contest. Yeah. Oh, this one's not going to thrill. Let me put my 10 lineups into the 50 cent and put $5 into that. Like whatever it is you're doing, whether you're max, whether you have multiple lineups, whether it's single entry. It's like, oh, this other spy is not going to fill. Let me put $100 into it. That a lot of people will do that just because they think they have an edge, just smashing the overlay. And that is one of those things that will fuck your bankroll.
No, I would agree. In fact, if I was gamifying this and I was an operator for Draftkings, or just say like a up and comer, or we don't even got a Queen's Gambit, started a fantasy like Draftkings, and they said, how would you structure a contest? I would tell them, make big contests and make sure those contests overlay. And I don't mean size, I mean money value. So instead of making a bunch of $1 contests are going to fill, make a $10, $15 contest that is going to overlay, or even $100, because then you're going to entice the gambler to make more bad decisions. And although some of these bigger, gambling sites,
see, that's probably not something that's going to work, because you're basically telling DraftKings, hey, put out a bunch of contests where you lose money every single time. Well, because maybe the sharps will come in and fill all that overlay and you won't lose money, and it's just a bunch of sharps in a contest.
Well, no, that's not. I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm saying this is like a week one strategy, right? This is like a week one thing, because you couldn't do this all the time.
No, yeah, week one, there will be much larger, like even like right now, normally, like to put in perspective for people, normally the Millionaire Maker for football has about 350 to 400,000 entrants.
Mm-hmm.
The Millionaire Maker for football for week one has 1.1 million entries. 3 times as big as a normal Millionaire Maker for football. So like there's going to be a lot of extra room for people week one. They intentionally build a lot. Like week one is the week where they probably are going to have a lot of contests like what you do. But I also would say, like, it's also sort of counterintuitive, because if you're a small bankroll person and you're grinding up, it's honestly better to not get in the original contests that they post. Because usually another thing DraftKings does is they'll have that $1 contest that has like 25,000 people in it. And then when it gets to about 20,000 people, they'll put up the exact same named contest for $1 that's only got 2,500 people in it, to try to give you, okay, here's a few thousand more. It's the same contest, so any people who have the same lineups or the same bankroll can put it in. It's just not as high of a first place. But you're also, it's 10% less. It's 10 times less to first place, but it's also 10 times less amount of people you're playing against. I would honestly say a small bankroll person should focus those contests. Wait until don't enter, build your lineups, but then don't enter anything until right before lock, and just enter one of the 2 contests that's going to be overlay, or one of the newer contests that's a lot smaller. Because like I said, you build different lineups for 1,000-man field and a 10,000-man field. It's a lot easier to win 1,000-man field than it is a 10,000-man field. So like that would be the smart thing I would tell newer players, is like, watch out for the trap that is overlay, because you do need to be watching that and probably getting into those contests first and foremost over than, I'll just throw $5 into the 10K for first single entry. Wait for the 1K to first single entry that's still $5. That's going to be put up like 10 minutes before the lock of the slate. And then put your $5 into that. You'll have a much higher ROI than just randomly thrown into the huge tournament. That would be a very smart thing to do. But again, that's something you have to, like, I had to learn that. No one really told me that. I'm trying to tell people that so they can get into it.
Well, Gov, can people like and subscribe to this podcast so we can get to our giveaways and our excitement? Because
with football season coming up, I like, subscribe, comment down below with anything you have to say. We are reading them and we will bring it up.
But please, because, and I say that to be funny, because in a way, but I mean it. Like, I want somebody to send me some pom-poms, because I just want to smash them together and just let you go, buddy. I just want to be your cheerleader because
There's times I will just roll with it. Yeah. Especially when we're in football season, I can talk.
Well, what you just said there, I almost want to just play it back and just like listen to it again, like I'm going to sleep.
Yeah. Anyone watching this on YouTube, clip it.
I mean, I really do think you summed it up perfectly. And I work in the psych field, and people say sometimes I connect, metaphors or ideas to sports too much. But I'm telling you, there's a concept that sometimes when people listen, they're just listening to find out when they can intersect the conversation and get their goddamn point across. They're just waiting for you to stop talking so they can talk. And that's not really active listening. That's more active talking.
Yeah, you heard something and then you're in your head just sort of waiting for a lull. Yeah.
And I think that happens so much in DFS, especially with like these more experienced grinders that we spoke about. I don't even want to give it a name, so let's just call her Whitney Jameson. And Whitney Jameson's a successful YouTuber, and she goes on 15 podcasts a week, and she's going on 15 podcasts, and she's successful. And so when she goes on X podcast, she's expected to give a take or have some nuance. But after 15 podcasts, you can only have so much nuance, And so then sometimes you either get fatigued, where it's like, oh, this is the 17th time I'm going to mention Trey Lance and the fact that he ran, what was it, his first start in his career, he ran 18 times,
Mm-hmm.
And that's a great stat. And it might be good information, and it might even come true week one. I spoke about Trey Lance and his possibilities to be great.
Right.
But at some point, Whitney Jameson's like, God, I already said that take 13 times. So I'm going to say something crazy. I'm going to say Jared Goff, bold statement, Jared Goff's going to lead the week one quarterbacks in fantasy points, total. And it's not that she did that to be mean or to mislead people. Like sometimes these touts or these people that have to like feel like they have to produce for an audience, at some point they just like they almost want to go off script. Like they've been doing Broadway shows for too long, and they just want to go off script to just see how wild they can get. I think that's probably the biggest mistake of some of these successful people.
I would agree with that 100%.
It's that and it's not even purposeful. It's not like there are bad people out there. I don't mind shouting out the bad people because I just think they're like Vegas Dave. I can't get behind his business model. But there are good people out there that have good intentions, like a Rich Rebar, for example. But he gets asked, to go on so many shows, and it's like, okay, well, they wanted to say something different because he said this over here at Underdog, and he said this over here at Ship Chasing. So now I'm going to go to a different YouTube channel, and I want Rich to wear a different style hat, and and then that gets oversaturated. So, let's do this because I don't think people will do this when they talk about management. We talk about contest selection a lot when we talk about bankroll management. But what about lineup management in this sense? Like, how much time should somebody spend on a lineup? And why should that change, do you think? Because I think it should.
I would say, yeah, it should.
It should.
Yeah.
Right. Just like we spoke about with contests in week one. Week one is like the WrestleMania for Draftkings. They're trying to pull in my buddy because right now my buddy will still bet me like we're in elementary school gov and like we're on the monkey bars, and he's like, I can hang on to the monkey bars longer than you. And he thinks every bet's a 1-for-1 bet. So he would say like, I think the Jets will have more wins than the Lions, but he doesn't want to give me plus odds or plus odds on his side. He just wants to bet it straight up because he has no idea how like gambling really works, right? And it's like, dude, I don't want to take money from my friends. Like I don't. And why would I do that when Draftkings will give me a plus 170? And he's like, what? I just want to make a friendly bet with you. And so we talked about casuals, and how they build lineups. But like as a general rule of thumb, if I said like build a lineup for me at 652, do you think you could build a good lineup in 15 minutes?
One, yes.
Do you think
like I could probably build two?
Okay.
Because they would be sort of like a offshoot. They'd be more of like a offshoot single entry version of one another. But I could probably build two. Maybe I've been doing 3 maxes in NBA, so maybe 3.
Okay.
But I cannot. But if you're only giving me 15 minutes, you're not getting more than like 1 or 2 good lineups out of me. I usually take a week to build my 5 or 6 for football.
Okay, so let me do this. Let me give you this scenario. You used to be a college kid, right? You used to throw like $10, $15 on DraftKings.
And when I started, it was definitely stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, you would do it with your buddies, and maybe you build a lineup together in a dorm room. Like one guy would choose a quarterback, the other guy would choose a wide receiver. Sometimes they would correlate, and then you wanted to take it more serious. So if you were this guy and you were like, okay, I'm going to take this more serious, I'm going to do an hour research, and then after that hour, I'm going to build 2 lineups, and they're going to take me 15 minutes. What's the first positions, or how do you construct that lineup? Because I don't think we talk enough about that. We talk about contest selection or specific players, but what are some of the first things you do in a lineup in terms of positioning or the allocation of salary?
First thing, like if I'm doing the research, then one of the things of research that I'm going to do is usually on projections and stuff like that. I want to know where the value is according to the projections, because that's the best place to start, is with the value in the projections. So if the projections are telling me that this 4K wide receiver is a must play, let's say it's Rondale Moore for Arizona, just for the sake of it, because he's 4K, and like we were talking about earlier, he might end up being the number 1 wide receiver for that team. So let's say that they say that this guy is just going to be one of the best plays at that price, or at that position, even at wide receiver. Okay, so I'm going to have a mid-price, cheap wide receiver. Let's say the next thing it tells you in the projections is that Christian McCaffrey is going to be has the highest projection of all, above anyone else.
Yeah.
So let's just say those 2 things are true when doing my research. Christian McCaffrey is the highest projected guy of all the guys on the slate. Rondale Moore has the highest value based off of his projection compared to his salary. So if that's going to be the start, then it's like, okay, that leads me to a specific kind of lineup where I have a price up running back and a mid-priced wide receiver. So depending on the contest is like, let's say this is my base to start from with my research. I know that this is the top guy. This is the top value. Now, maybe you try to use the knowledge we've been talking about to build a good lineup for whatever contest. If it's a cash game, you can throw in some more chalky value guys. If it's a tournament, then I would figure out how to correlate one or both of these guys with other people in the lineup and fill out the lineup from there, while also sort of looking at projections and ownership to determine whether you have leverage.
Well, let me get in on this for a minute. So if I put those 2 guys in, and not to say we're going to build this lineup,
right? But just looking.
If I put these 2 guys in, you have $5,000 remaining on average for your position, but you have a defense. Okay.
Right.
So at that point, you have Christian McCaffrey playing the Cleveland Browns, and you have Arizona playing the Chiefs. If I was to look at that, the casual is going to say, well, let me get Mahomes, or let me get, Travis Kelce, because that game's going to be a shootout.
Right. And
That
I don't mind doing that, but I would much prefer, like, my thought is those are both solid thoughts. And I do think people will think that. Like, if you have Rondell Moore and Christian McCaffrey, you might be trying to get a Kelsey or a Mahomes to have a KC guy.
yeah.
Like, that makes sense. I would be more willing to get the Arizona guy. Like, I would just grab Kyler. And, like, with me, again, if I'm thinking about this from a tournament where I'm trying to build a good tournament lineup, I would grab Kyler and then maybe grab Kelsey for the other side, or Juju, or like I like when I'm stacking to grab a piece from the other side. I like to stack a game as opposed to a team, because usually it's not just a team that goes off. Usually a whole game has a high total. Both teams go for 30, but one team wins 35 to 32. It's not as often that you have like a 28 to 10 win where you only want the team from the one side. Usually when that happens, it's like 17-10, and then you can probably fade that entire game.
Right.
So, like, in my thought, I like, of those two guys that we had in with McCaffrey, I would definitely be more aligned to stack the KC Arizona game. And I would probably grab Kyler and then one of Kelsey or Juju on the other side. But considering the money we have, you could probably just grab Kelsey and fill in your tight end spot.
Yeah. Well, I think week one, especially, you can pretty much do whatever you want.
Yeah, like I said, the prices on certain guys are going to be really available. If you go with cheap defense and you don't like pay up for one of the Jonathan Taylors or Christian McCaffreys or Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, stuff like that, if you don't pay up for one of those guys, you can basically build almost anything because the pricing is a little softer all around. There's no high-priced quarterback that's hard to stack. All of that stuff.
I talked about you being the star quarterback and me just flashing the pom-pom. So let me go back to a beautiful thing that you said that I want to elaborate on. Patrick Mahomes is 7,700, right? The most expensive quarterback. And again, we're not building lines because we're like 3 weeks away. There's plenty of shows where I'm gonna bring on my friends and it'll be like a happy hour and we can drink some and have a good laugh. And then we'll have a more structured show where we'll break it down when we know more injuries. But this was more meant to be a kind of a management, kind of like, I want you to go to the car lot and I want you to look at all the cars and I want you to find what you're comfortable with. And that doesn't always mean value. And that doesn't always mean going to the most expensive. It means finding what works for you, all the amenities that you need. And Gov's point here, and I don't know if you did this on purpose, I assume you did because you're smart. Outside of the point he mentioned, Mahomes is 7,700. I'll repeat that again. Kyler Murray is 7,200. So it's like, well, you guys talked about value and expensive, but no, it's not always about that. It's also about ownership. And
exactly. A lot of people are going to grab Mahomes from that game.
Right.
And that right there might be the leverage spot I need. It's like, well, if you're starting with McCaffrey and Rondale, a lot of people are going to go Mahomes Kelsey or Mahomes Juju and stack that game with the high-end running back. I'll stack the other side of that game if it looks like that gives me some leverage.
Right. Or let's assume that you grind the tape, right? A grinder is going to say, oh, well, I can go. I didn't mean to go Teddy Bridgewater here. I meant to go the Browns quarterback, Brissett. And I'll just stack it that way because I have Christian McCaffrey, so I have one cheap, I'll have a cheap quarterback and a real expensive running back, and then they'll flip flop. They'll go cheap wide receiver, expensive wide receiver. But it's not always the correlation to the cheap, expensive. It's what isn't happening. Like, people tend to shop when they go to grocery stores with their eyes. They'll look at the most expensive things and they'll look at the cheapest things,
Oh yeah, people browse.
Right. And so when you're browsing, you're gonna see, you might see a a value like Mahomes, he might be a value based on your lineup, or they're gonna be like, well, I can just drop down and get even
Davis
a
Mills of Houston starting. There you go.
Davis Mills, right?
Baker Mayfield of Carolina. Yeah.
Right. So by you doing that, you're saying like you're basically hoping that you get the Patrick Mahomes performance, but you get it at much lower ownership, and that therefore they should be about the same price. You acknowledge that, but the ownership tilts you to Murray.
Correct. And if it comes up the other way, if everyone's talking up Arizona and Mahomes is being slept on, Mahomes becomes the better leverage play, and I will have some of him in my large field tournaments more than Kyler.
So
As of right now, I would say that Mahomes is probably the owned guy, and Murray is the leverage play.
So now we have 4,000 remaining on average. What's the, not to say you would do this, like I want you to almost work through it and not do it, but if I tied you into that and said, what's the worst decision you could make in this lineup now? And then how not to make that mistake. And I don't know if you can see the lineup, so
no, I see it. Kyler, McCaffrey, Moore, Kelsey. The worst decision that you could make in this lineup. Honestly, I think the worst decision to make in this lineup right now would be to just throw any random person that you like in there. Like with the way the lineup is now, if you're not now trying to correlate something to McCaffrey, I would be trying to get in a highly projected or high, like, again, depending, like if this were Mahomes instead of Murray and we needed leverage, I would try to find a high leverage play or players. Like, for example, I like a mini stack of a game inside of my lineups. So like one of the ones I like right now that I might put here would be to go Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Yep.
And like Miles Sanders or something at running back.
What?
Give me a Detroit Philly mini stack because that game could score some points. So let me see if I can get one of the players. That's the thing. Like the lineup's not done where you don't need to correlate. So I would definitely have that first and foremost. I wouldn't just be like, all right, who's the next best? I wouldn't go to projection and be like, all right, let's just plug in the next highest projection and go from there.
Let me prove your point, Go, from a visual standpoint. Let's assume that.
Let's just plug in Jonathan Taylor now.
Or I was even going to go worse because Jonathan Taylor at least has a good matchup. I mean, with the Houston Texans, and we might be able to get a cheap Houston guy in the back. I don't think I think the Giants are going to be highly owned.
Yeah, so if you just plug in Derrick Henry because you think he's going to be the best back.
So you're like, Derrick Henry, he won me a best ball contest 2 years ago. He's the best guy. And then you're like, well, I heard Alan Lazard is the number one guy for Green Bay, and Aaron Rodgers just won the Super Bowl, so you plug him in. And now Gov is right. Now you have no correlation.
Yeah, now you have no correlation. You've got a couple spots left. You've spent a lot of money. Like, now you're trying to fix that lineup as opposed to slowly building a good one.
Or let's assume that you did that, right? You do that, and you're like, well, okay.
I got Henry, and I got Lazard.
I have to get correlation. Gov told me correlation. So then you end up getting a cheap receiver. You go with a Sky Moore from Kansas City. And it's like, if you think.
Or you play Kadarius Toney on the other side of Henry or something like that, or a crappy Giants receiver on the other side of Henry.
Yeah.
Or even like not Amari Cooper on the other side of McCaffrey for Cleveland.
Right.
Like now you're trying to find a cheap guy that just sort of correlates with a guy in your lineup. I'm like, no, you don't correlation is very strong and key, but it's not like you just blow everything else out of the water to correlate.
Yeah. We all know you should wear pants with your shirt. There are situations where you would wear bottoms and not a top if you were going swimming. So there are times and places for everything. But so you shouldn't force something in, even if it is with the best intentions. Even if you think Derrick Henry is the best running back on the slate, okay, well then build a correlated lineup around that. That's a bit different, take Henry and Tony, or Herb Smith, or some of these other moves, but do it in a way that makes sense for the entirety of your lineup. So if you weren't going to do that and you were going to really think about it, what's the next step you would do for this lineup? Go.
Okay, so the next step, if I'm really trying to build it good, okay. Well, again, I want to think about correlation. Is there anywhere else in this lineup that a correlated piece would work? Otherwise, I would then try to get a good, like I said, if that's not the case, then I'm going to look for another game that I like and get two good pieces out of it. And I want the two good pieces out of it. So that's the decision I would make now. Is like, personally, I would want to do something with McCaffrey, because I think that's also a place to get leverage. Most people just throw a running back, especially a high-priced running back. They throw that in the lineup and just let it be. I love correlating that running back with something, whether it's a wide receiver from the other team, or specifically what I would want to do in this lineup is the defense. I don't trust Cleveland. So I would grab the Panthers defense and correlate that with McCaffrey.
Yeah,
because they don't correlate as strongly as wide receiver or quarterback, but when a defense is doing well, the running back tends to get more time and touches because you're trying to eat the clock.
I do agree.
The defense gets you up, you're trying to eat the clock. So that would be one. And I don't trust Cleveland's quarterbacks to not be turnover prone with Jacoby Brissett in that. I could totally see him having a bad game where then he has to throw because they're down, and now the defense gets more points. They're down, so we just feed McCaffrey most of the game.
I would agree with that, and I want to push back on this theory that's mostly true, but I think it really merits together what we're saying in this whole discussion, Doug, is that there are exceptions to every rule. So, like, normally you wouldn't play two running backs together in the same lineup, right? Because usually running backs are more involved in slower paced games. And if slower paced games are happening, usually the defense on the opposite side, the Gov's point, is the one dominating. But I'm not even saying this is a surefire way to do it, but I do think in this example, it would make sense to play Nick Chubb and McCaffrey if you value McCaffrey as a jackknife. Basically, if you thought of McCaffrey as a dual threat, as a wide receiver, that would make sense. I think it only makes sense if you're talking about running backs that you think are going to catch 6 or more passes, which McCaffrey would fall under, which a guy like Swift may fall under, DeAndre Swift.
Right.
You may even play Miles Sanders, who Gov also brought up a little while ago. But in most cases, like a Kamara, but in most cases you wouldn't do that. But that's an example where you would. And so, like,
well, I wouldn't say would, but could. Like, I personally, there's like three, like you're saying, there's like 2 or 3 running backs that get enough volume where even if the game script doesn't work for them, you could still have the running back from both teams in the lineup. But to be fair, that's one of the few negatively correlated things that I really don't like. Like, it only is because of McCaffrey that could work. Because really, for that stack to work, you need Cleveland to get up and feed Chubb so that he's a monster. And then Carolina's down and McCaffrey's their main dude, so he's going to get the work anyway, and he gets the work in every way. So it's hard. It's almost impossible for him to lose work just because they're losing at a big pace, where most running backs get less carries when you're down and have to throw.
Well, yeah.
So, like, you're right. This is the scenario with McCaffrey where that would be okay. I would not recommend that, but I learned long ago that it does work having both running backs from the same team, but it is also a specific scenario that you have to truly think is going to happen. I don't. I don't see that game going in a way where Chubb has a big game and McCaffrey. I can definitely see there's a lot of ways McCaffrey can have a big game. I don't see this being some major game for Chubb. That's not one of doing research. I would say I'd get off. While I'm doing research, I'd probably get off of something like that because it doesn't look like a good play. But I do like that you brought up that kind of correlation and pairing because most people won't think about playing dueling running backs. But when you have a McCaffrey or a Dalvin Cook or an Alvin Kamara, like you said, that gets both sides of the work, it can work. But then you need to make sure you're focusing. Okay, if McCaffrey's the guy that can get all the work, or Kamara, whoever it is, then I need to focus on the other side and make sure that other side is the good play. Because that's the side that's going to screw me. If that side doesn't go right, I might still get my points from McCaffrey. But if Chubb screws me, then that's just a bad. Oh, okay. Well, I made a correlation that's not a strong correlation, and it kind of screwed me because that's the thing. McCaffrey is on the side where he can go off, or if Chubb goes off, he can correlate and go off because of the way he plays. But if McCaffrey has a big game, Chubb could totally be left to the wayside. If Chubb has a bad game, that doesn't mean you don't need to play McCaffrey.
Well, let me give you another example of how that might work. So we already might think as grinders that the best receiver on Green Bay is Aaron Jones.
Probably, yeah. He's to a degree, yes.
Aaron Jones might be the best receiver on that team now that they don't have Adams. And I want to play Cooks because he's in a fun new offense. And his coach said in training camp that they're going to throw more passes. And so that's a case where you might play both running backs because you're expecting them to be more wide receivers. Maybe not more so than running back, but you're expecting them to be more of a dual threat. And consequently, I think everyone looks at Deebo Samuel from last year and it's like, well, this wide receiver, played running back. So therefore, the Bills flirted with the idea of putting McKenzie at running back this year, who is a wide receiver. Therefore, I got to make sure I get him in my lineup. I think this is where being a football fan matters, Gov, because you can't just say, oh, well, it worked for X team or X coach likes to do this. Therefore, I'm going to do this. I think you really have to pay attention to beat writers and know the teams and know the philosophy and know the injury reports and stuff like that, even in week one. Maybe even more so. So I think that was a good conversation, Gov. Is there anything else you want to add before we get out of here? I want to kind of save some stuff for these next
some later episodes. Yeah, no, I think we're good. This was a good little first talk, going through what it looks like, going through some lineup building. I hope everyone takes the advice of we're about to start a season. You have a long season to get through. Don't blow your bankroll just because of one good win.
Well, that's great. And I would love to have that conversation with you again.
Maybe we can go more in depth into it in another podcast. If we see it in the comments that people really want us to talk about that, we could do a full bankroll management show if we wanted to.
I almost want to do before the season starts at some point, if we can get into it, is how fantasy sports and these analysts are going to change the way we view sports this year. We've seen a lot of changeovers with announcers, but even shout out to Matthew Berry. I wanted to end the show with this. Matthew Berry decided to leave ESPN and venture out and do his own newsletter, which he's been doing for a while. But he said basically in an article I read that he wanted to do more DFS content and gambling and betting, and ESPN was kind of uncomfortable with that. And NBC gave him a platform. And they put him to work right at the Hall of Fame game. As he was right up there with Tony Dungy and these type of guys, where I don't think ESPN was quite ready to do that. And so I'm not even saying that we're getting respect and we deserve it. But I do think the landscape is changing. And so I just wanted to shout out Matthew Berry and his successes at ESPN and like his new venture. And I think it's important that a guy that's been as established as Matthew Berry, that's leaving the mothership. You can think what you want about ESPN, but they're a flag, they're the flagship for a reason. That fantasy show would not be the same without Matthew Berry. And now he's kind of going off and doing his own thing and having more freedom. Not to say it's right or wrong. I think it's different. And I do think it's going to provide fantasy players with a different perspective of maybe the season.
I would agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. So thank you, Matthew Berry, for that. I'll sign out how Matthew Berry usually signs out to ESPN. Peace out.